Stephanie Carvin is an assistant professor of international relations at the Norman Paterson School of International Affairs at Carleton University. As you can see, she's with me now. And Stephanie, first of all, thanks for taking time to speak with me. I want to talk to you about the report on the India trip, surely, but also about a warning we got today from the head of Canada's intelligence service. Now, these two conversations, I think, go together. But let's start by breaking down this report on the India trip and reaction to it into a couple of areas. The role of the RCMP and the lack of key information made public on the suggestion of third-party interference in the Prime Minister's trip and some of the embarrassing aspects of that. But first, let me talk about the RCMP and the failure by the RCMP to tell the security detail on the ground in India that Jasper Latwal was on the guest list for two events with the Prime Minister. How worrisome is that?
It's not great. I mean, the RCMP does not come out in a great light here. And, this information doesn't seem to have been passed on for a number of very kind of silly reasons. The fact that people are going on vacation, the fact that people left voicemails to other people who were on vacation. Someone got, this information and they said, I'll deal with it tomorrow. And that was the day of the party. So, it's doesn't look great. I mean, to be fair to the RCMP, Mr. Atwal certainly had a criminal record, but he doesn't appear to have been the subject of any major threat investigation or national security investigation, so maybe it wasn't seen as a priority, but it probably should have been. And so what I think this report highlights is the fact that the RCMP failed to assess this information properly, failed to see the urgency, did not make the correct judgments, but also the fact that there doesn't seem to have been a procedure in place for when the RCMP comes across this information, who they should actually notify.
Right.
That's one thing. So there doesn't actually seem to have been a process. So hopefully, if anything good comes out of this, hopefully it will be the fact that a process is developed.
Well, that's kind of interesting too, right? Because the report found, the committee found that even after all of this, there didn't seem to be a learned lessons process to what could be done differently. Presumably there will be now, but at the time of the committee investigation, nobody seemed to be too fussed by this.
Right. That seems to be a key investigation, or say a key finding of this report, that, there should be a lessons learned put in place. And I think there probably will be. Look, to give the RCMP, again, a little bit of credit here, these things are very hard. Seek extreme violent extremism isn't a priority threat for Canadian national security, and really hasn't been since 9/11. So, they may not have necessarily recognized what was happening, although they do appear to have recognized that this person did have a criminal record and was known to be violent. So that in and of itself really should have set off some flags, but instead it seems to have set off a bunch of voicemails.
What should be done about the finding that no one really vets the guest list for these big events with the Prime Minister, and in fact, the security agencies and the PMO haven't, as we said, haven't done the lessons learned review to figure out what went wrong in the case of the India trip. But that seems to be a sort of, and again, I'm not in security, but you are. That would seem to be a security 101 kind of thing, isn't it? There's a big event with the Prime Minister. We need to know everything we can about who's been invited and who's going to be there tonight, and yet there doesn't seem to be that process in place.
Right. I mean, this is a very challenging question, but the issue is, do you want the national security agencies of this country, which are already overwhelmed with investigations and have been asking for more resources, do you want to take them off their task of investigating threats to national security and put them on vetting cocktail parties for politicians? And then actually having them to make judgments about, well, is this a political risk or a national security risk? By and large, these decisions should, they have rested with PMO. They should probably stay with PMO. And, often political parties, it's my understanding, and I'm not in one, so it's hard to know, but political parties tend to either use their own staff, such as interns, or their political research firms in order to kind of Google these people to see if something's coming up. But also on the ground, there's impressive physical security as well surrounding the Prime Minister at all times. So the idea that CSIS and RCMP should be vetting cocktail lists is something I'm deeply uncomfortable with.
Okay, let's shift to the committee findings in its examination of allegations made by the Prime Minister's National Security Advisor at that time. It had 6 findings on what Danielle Jean had to say, that rogue elements within the Indian government arranged Atwal's presence at the events with the Prime Minister, defeat allegations that the Canadian government is cozy with Sikh extremists. But the findings are all blacked out. The PM says that was done by security officials. What do you make of that? Having made the comments publicly and having had a committee investigate, do Canadians have the right to know whether what the security advisor said at the time is true or not?
So there are hints in the report. For example, there's no express denial that there's clandestine foreign influence involved. Perhaps not in this particular case. We don't know about this particular case, which, okay, there may be some questions there. But there seems to be an acknowledgement in the report that there is a context here of foreign influence activities in Canada, as well as Sikh extremism activities in Canada. And we see this in the recommendations, that it basically says that MPs should be given greater briefings or greater number of briefings and training on violent extremism and foreign influence in Canada, which is an implicit acknowledgement that these things did take place and do form the backdrop of this event. And so you have to be careful when you read it. There are some things there between the lines. The committee seems to have based its findings. If you look in the footnotes, even the redacted information, it's clear that they were using CSIS intelligence assessments, CSIS briefings, special national security briefings. So these were highly classified documents that were provided. The report says that they consulted 2,400 documents. I imagine most of those would have been pretty highly classified. And you want to protect them because they are probably from human sources who put themselves at personal risk in order to provide information to the security services or signals intelligence. So you need to protect those. It is unfortunate, but it is a reality of the intelligence business.
Okay, foreign interference, it's a timely conversation we're having because it's also in the news today because of the comments made by the director of CSIS, the intelligence service, saying in a speech in Toronto today about how widespread state-sponsored espionage in Canada is developing and growing. It's a bigger threat than terrorism, and warning Canadian companies to be aware that these foreign entities are using extortion, buying up companies, cyber attacks, doing whatever they have to do to get at trade secrets, and even influence decision-making in democratic systems under threat in the country. What do you think of those comments?
They were astonishing. And I think the thing I found most remarkable is that while the director had said that terrorism remains the number one danger to public safety, the number one threat to the national interest of this country is now considered to be foreign influence and espionage activities. And this is the first time that CSIS has said something like this since 9/11. So basically, just over 17 years ago. So it's been almost 2 decades since we've kind of taken this view. And it is a significant acknowledgement of the shift in the landscape that we're seeing. And, there's a real problem with the fact that intelligence agencies, they gather this information, but how do you make this information public? How do you translate this for business leaders who, and going ahead and making deals overseas, maybe putting their intellectual property at risk, maybe even putting the security of Canada at risk, depending on the significance of their technology. So it's trying to introduce security into the conversation, into the thinking of the private sector, because, they are responsible for so much Canadian prosperity and the livelihoods of Canadians that, they need to be thinking about this as well.
Let me quickly finish on this, then the brief time we have. I'm curious about the timing of these remarks by the director of CSIS, and I'm curious for this reason. For the director to come out and say that now, does that mean this is a significant problem growing, or does it mean for him to actually make that public statement means that it is here, it might even be starting to overwhelm us in some ways? Tell me about the timing of the statement. Why is he making it now, and what does that mean about how far along foreign interference might be?
So we have seen, the CSIS increasingly make remarks in these areas, and talking about these areas. They provided input into a report on threats to democratic institutions last summer, and as well, I was able to interview the director for a podcast I run, and he acknowledged in the spring that while terrorism, remains a paramount threat, it's not going away. Other threats are actually catching up to it. But this is the first acknowledgement that I've seen that it's actually surpassing that. I think the context is important, not necessarily. I mean, look, foreign influence has always been here in Canada. It's been here for decades. This is not a particularly new thing, but technologies has made it a lot easier to actually do. The significance of the comments is that this is coming less than a year before a federal election, and it's something that perhaps the CSE, CSIS, the other intelligence community agencies and departments are increasingly worried about as we do head into that election, that there may be attempts at foreign influence like we've seen in other countries.
All right, Stephanie Carvin, always good to get your perspective. Thanks for it again tonight. We'll talk again soon.
Thanks for having me on.